Welcome to Module 10. In this module, we're going to be talking about the socio-emotional development in adolescence. Remember that these kiddos begin adolescence in roughly ages 10 to 12, and they will typically end adolescence in ages between 18 and 22. So like at the end of high school, maybe at some point during their, if they decide to have a 4-year college experience, those 4 years, or maybe even at the end. As we are working our way through this module, we're going to be specifically talking about a few things. And we are going to be really touching on identity, families, peers, and culture. Those 4 things I would like for you to, and for your reflection, reflect through one paragraph per topic for each of those. So as we are going through this quick little lecture, really take note when we're talking about identity, families, peers, and culture, because that is going to be what is asked for you to reflect upon in your chapter reflection. So as we jump in here, we can see that identity really is the decisions about who someone is beginning to become. And so they are going to kind of form the core of who they are during this adolescent years. And so they are as they are growing through this time, they are figuring out and making choices between vocational and careers, political choices, religious choices on who they are siding more with. Relationships, achievement, intellectual identity is all forming right now. Same with their sexual identity, culture and ethnicity, what is pulling them, if it is, how hard, interests, personality, and then physical identity. All of these things are going into one form of who this person is becoming as they exit adolescence and as they enter adulthood. One of the theorists that did some of the first work in understanding the importance of this stage in adolescence was Erickson, and he had his identity versus identity confusion stage. And he really did some research on the psychosocial moratorium, and that's really just that gap between childhood security and adult autonomy. And some of us really can say, oh, I'm a little bit closer to that experience than some of us, but some of us still might really remember that feeling between the security of being a child and then the autonomy, which is freeing in a lot of ways, but can be scary, of being an adult. But he really did a lot of work with adolescents experimenting with the different roles and personalities of who they are, who they want to be, who they think they're becoming, with all of those. And he really investigated how they cope with conflicting identities, and from that, how these people at this age group emerge with a new sense of self, and then the idea that some adolescents do not successfully resolve the identity crisis and they can suffer identity confusion. We can see that these developmental changes happen. Crises is typically what this period is called, and it's the idea that it happens through development, and it's when they're exploring alternatives. They're exploring alternatives in career, in politics, and religion, and relationships, and sexual identity, and culture, and interest, and all of those things. They are choosing between those two. And so we used to call them crises a lot, and now research really likes to coin the phrase exploration. They're exploring between those two things. Marcia's 4 statuses of identity leads us to identity diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. And we can see that in identity diffusion, that's the idea that there's not yet experiences crises, but they have made a commitment. Identity foreclosure, they've made a commitment, but there's no crisis. Identity moratorium, they're in the middle of a crisis, and the commitment has been absent or vaguely defined. And then identity achievement, they have had a crisis in their life and they have made a commitment onto exploring who they are a little bit. As these people are emerging into adulthood and beyond, we can see key changes in their identity, and these are often more likely to take place as they're getting closer to adulthood than in adolescence. Identity does not remain stable throughout someone's life. And we can see the kind of cycle of moratorium to achievement over and over and over again. And as we enter future modules, like I believe module 12 or 13, we're going to look specifically at middle adulthood, and you're going to ask some questions about, hey, is this something only adolescents experience on figuring out who they are, their interests, who they're becoming, or does this happen continually throughout adulthood? And I think you'll be surprised to see that adults also experience these type of identity shifts. Culture and ethnicity goes into who people are, who they think they are, who they want to become. A sense of membership in an ethnic group can lead people to decide who they are becoming in the world. Attitudes and feelings related to that membership, are they being forced into that kind of culture, or are they choosing to do so? Many adolescents develop a bicultural identity, and that's simply identifying with both their ethnic group and the majority culture. And so who their family is and the culture and customs that they've grown up with, but also that kind of morphing with the culture, the majority culture at their high school or their friend groups. Families do play a really important role in adolescence. Parents really can be looked at as managers. They're monitoring, they're supervising, and they're kind of doing that kind of with a little bit more of a hands-off approach oftentimes, and they are really kind of supervising adolescents, their specific choice of social settings. Who are these adolescents choosing? Where are they choosing to go and hang out? What activities are they choosing to do, or friends are they choosing to make? Their academic efforts, if they're engaging later in sex, or if they're deciding to engage in that during adolescence. And these parents are trying to kind of monitor and supervise alcohol use in depressed teens. When parents engage in positive parenting practices, adolescents are more likely to disclose information, and that is really important. And we saw that in autonomy and attachment, kind of those two different roles. Parents really must weigh the needs for autonomy and control, that's what they want, with the independence that their adolescents are really yearning for. The push for autonomy may puzzle and frustrate some parents, and this is common. Adolescents desire to make decisions and spend time with friends, and these friend groups are becoming more and more important in their lives. Studies show that typically boys are given more independence. When females and males are given autonomy, they feel they have more independence and they have better relationships with their parents. That's why a lot of times we call it like it's a very interesting situation, giving adolescents enough control of their lives and independence to feel like that they do have control of their lives, but not too much that they can make some really big mistakes. We also see how cultural diversity and timing and roles must be considered, and this is just really how soon autonomy is experienced can change based on the ethnicity of the adolescents and what their families deem acceptable. The role of attachment, if you can remember the socio-emotional health in past years, infancy, early childhood, those were largely affected by the attachment to caregivers. And we see it brought up again in adolescence. Securely attached adolescents are less likely to have emotional difficulties and to engage in problem behaviors. juvenile delinquency, and drug abuse. And so that's something really important. Parents should not simply just wash their hands of their kids and say, see you in 6 years when we get out of this. They really have to kind of trudge through the difficult times with their adolescent children. Parents and adolescents will have conflict. Increases in early adolescence have happened, and typically it just involves everyday events, keeping your bedroom clean, how they are choosing to dress, curfews, time spent with friends, and they're really rarely related to major issues. The role of conflict, it's important to facilitate adolescents' transition from independence to autonomy. It's really important to facilitate the conflict, not just ignore it. It teaches conflict and negotiation that has a positive developmental function and can manage parental hostility. So really talking through things is very important with adolescents. Friendships, like I said before, is really important to this age group. Most teens prefer a smaller number of friendships that are more intense and more intimate. Friends become increasingly more important, and they meet in many social needs that adolescents may have. And developmental advantages occur when adolescents have friends who are socially skilled, supportive, and really oriented towards academic achievement. There can be disadvantages when adolescents' friends group encourage drinking or bad behaviors. There's lots of conflict in those peer groups, or they have poor quality friendships. And so friends can really help, and friends can really hinder some things. Peer pressure is something that needs to be discussed. Young adolescents conform more to peer standards than children do, and so even if a child has made it pretty far in life without bending to peer pressure, adolescence is going to be the time it's really tested. Boys are more influenced by peer pressure involving sexual behavior than girls. Adolescents with low self-esteem and high social anxiety are most likely to conform to peers and during transitions, like if they've moved or they've gone to a new school. There's a difference between cliques and crowds. Cliques are typically small groups averaging 5 to 6 people that engage in similar activities. A lot of times it'll happen if they are all in a certain club or group in school. Crowds are larger than cliques and less personal. Members do not spend much time together, and they're just solely based on either reputation or shared activities, like we are all in band, we are all in volleyball, we are all in the chess club. That is more of a crowd. Dating and romantic relationships begin to blossom at this age. Developmental changes in dating and romantic relationships change kind of through 3 stages. You have ages about 11 to 13 years old, and those kind of have more what I would term like a crush. Romantic attractions and affiliations begin to happen. Ages 14 to 16 years, their romantic relationships typically involve their friend groups. They play a role in communication between the two that are interested. And then we have romantic bonds that begin to happen at around ages 17 to 19 years of age, and those relationships typically last about a year or longer, and so they get more serious as they get older. There are culture and adolescent development. When we look at that, there are cross-cultural comparisons that we see, and traditions and circumstances influences development around the world. So, for example, health in adolescence, there's less death due to diseases and malnutrition, but there are more deaths due to the effect of certain behaviors, like if we are talking about drugs, maybe lack of health care. When we look at gender in adolescence, boys tend to receive more education, except for in Japan, the Philippines, and Western countries. Family has differentials in adolescence, if they're close-knit versus if the parents are needing to work far away. Peers A lot of times will become the surrogate family, or they could be restricted. It could be depending on this cultural comparisons that we're doing here. Um, Especially for girls, some um, friend group roles become more of a parenting role. Um, and those friends take on more responsibilities in that way. And then we have rites of passage that happen sometimes in adolescence. When we are looking at ethnicity, something that I want you guys to be just aware of is immigration. Immigrants experience multiple stressors, including language, separation from support systems and culture, depression, low self esteem, and discrimination. And those are all things that you should really be cognizant of in your classroom when you are teaching a diverse group of people. Um, Ethnicity and socioeconomic status is something that is kind of important to be discussed. They can interact together, but a lot of times we will say something has to deal more with ethnicity, and in real life it has more to do with the socioeconomic status, or the SES, of a particular family. And so a lot of times when we say, oh well, it's because they come from an ethnic family, no, it's we can base these things on being maybe a poor family. Now, not all ethnic families, not all immigrants come to our country and have low SES, but a lot of times we like to blame certain things on ethnicity and not just having a lower SES. Low SES minorities, adolescents experience prejudices, discrimination, and bias, and this is really stressful. Middle income minority adolescents experience prejudice, discrimination, and bias. And so you can see that a lot of times we are putting things on children that is completely unnecessary. And sometimes even these middle income minority children cannot escape the prejudices, discrimination, and biases, like it says there. Media is something really big that we need to discuss. The media and media use includes email, instant messaging, social networking sites, chat rooms, video sharing, and photo sharing. We typically refer to it now as just simply screen time, because it's not only watching TV, it is including all of those things. We can see that adolescents have an increased media use through cell phones and tablets during this age group. And with an increase in cell phones, we see that just having or possessing a cell phone. In 2004, 39% of adolescents had cell phones, and it's projected that by 2019, 93% will have them. You can tell this book was written a couple years ago. We also see that daily use of social media and text messaging, 92% of 13 to 17-year-olds communicate with friends via text message only. That kind of blows my mind. Adolescents prefer to connect with parents via voicemail. 75% of percent are on social media sites, which is interesting because some of those have age restrictions that aren't being followed. 24% are almost constantly online on smartphones or on mobile devices. And something really important there is then a more screen time that there are, the lower quality of life, or less screen time equals a higher quality of life. And that is just something to really note when we are looking at raising and developing adolescents the most appropriate way. You can see here just a cool graph that I wanted you guys to see. This is the amount of time 8 to 18-year-olds spend with different types of media. And so we can see our 8 to 10-year-olds, how much time they spend with TV, with music, computers, video games, their total media exposure, and then total media use. And then you can see that changing with the orange 11 to 14-year-olds and the blue 15 to 18-year-olds. When we are talking about some problems in adolescence, we're going to, of course, talk about juvenile delinquency. A lot of times this is when an adolescent breaks the law or engages in behavior that is considered illegal. Males are more likely to engage in delinquency than females, and rates among minority groups and lower SES youth are especially high. And this makes me think about what we just talked about a couple slides ago. What part of that is minority and what part of that is a lower SES? Causes of delinquency, a lot of times lower SES culture. Parents are less skilled in discouraging antisocial behavior, kind of the parents' response to that, and siblings and delinquent peers can easily lead to juvenile delinquency. Another problem in adolescence that we need to talk about is depression and suicide. Your genes, family factors, poor relationships can all go into factors contributing to depression. We can treat it a number of different ways: drug therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and interpersonal therapy. But something really big is that suicide is the third leading cause of death in 10 to 19-year-olds. I think that's a pretty serious statement there. And then adolescents contemplate or attempt it unsuccessfully more often than they actually commit it. So we see that suicide, successful suicide, if you can actually say that, third leading cause of death. But there have been a lot more unsuccessful. That sounds so odd to me. There's been a lot more attempts for suicide that actually lead to death. Females are more likely to attempt suicide, but males are more likely to succeed. So this is just something that you really need to have on your mind when you are working with adolescent children. And then we can see here another one of these graphs, and what it's doing is it's looking at different ethnicity groups, and you can see there the different colors, and then also males and females, and the suicide attempt rates, and those look like percentages on the left side. So you can take a moment and look those over. When we are looking at the interrelation of problems and successful prevention, there are some things there. 4 problems that affect the most adolescents: drug abuse, juvenile delinquency, sexual problems, and school-related problems. And we can see here that successful intervention programs include, and they work, are intensive individualized attention, community-wide multi-agency collaborative approaches, and early identification and intervention. All of these things are really powerful if you are going to be working in some capacity with adolescents. And I would say that most of us, even if you plan on becoming a primary school teacher, you are going to know adolescents, or you are slowly coming out of the adolescence stage. And some of these things are just really important to know and talk about and just to consider.